Hi, Kate Fry here with another video. This time I'm going to try something a little different. My previous videos were my previous videos talked about socialist history and theory, and I put a lot of research, a lot of work into them. Very labor intensive. I enjoy doing it, and I think it's something the left badly needs to work on. Education. Also did a variety of interviews. They were easier. They were a lot of fun. I did some prep work for them, but they were much easier. I don't agree with everything the people I interview say, but I think they are interesting and have something important for people to know. With this video, I'm trying something a little different. This is more off the top of my head and my thoughts on the current political moment, what's been going on, and also the comedian Jimmy Dore. Of all people, he's been playing a really interesting role recently, and I'm going to talk about this. We'll see how it goes. So, introductory here. First of all, I hope no one thinks I'm a Trump supporter. I'm really not. He's a horrible guy. He's a right-wing populist, racist demagogue, basically, anti-worker. He talked about draining the swamp, but he really horrible corporate predators in his cabinet, his corporate tax cut, his one thing after another. The way he handled the pandemic is horrific. So yeah, I no way support Trump, of course not. But I think that almost by definition, so many people were badly misreading what's been going on, the current political movement. So first of all, uh, well, liberals by definition, a lot of people on the radical left. There's been this taking Trump out of context and all ahistorical hysteria whipped up around Trump. First of all, okay, the Democrats basically created Trump. The Podesta emails. So John Podesta was one of the main campaign managers of Hillary Clinton in 2016. He was a longtime Clinton operative, close to the Clintons. So he had part of the WikiLeaks revelations, several batches of leaks that they published. They weren't hacks, they were leaks. John Podesta, by the way, his internet security showed staggering levels of incompetence for someone who's a manager of a major political campaign. At one point, he left his smartphone in a taxi for a few hours, returned, I guess, a few hours later. Another point, his internet password was literally password. It's kind of insane. But anyway, these Podesta emails showed emails back and forth with people in the Clinton campaign, showing efforts to entice Donald Trump to run. Donald Trump and Ted Cruz to run as a foil, like they were considered bozo characters. No one would vote for him. Back then, Jeb Bush was the official front runner in the Republican campaign, and he quickly bombed out. And Trump was regarded as an absurd figure. No one would vote for him. So they were putting him up as a foil, as easy foil. And it turned out it backfired on the Clinton people very badly. Interesting stuff about that. First of all, the Hillary Clinton actually won the campaign by 2.5 million votes. The three states which through the Electoral College, interestingly, had the three highest casualty rates in the Iraq War. And also Clinton people, Bill Clinton's administration, the famous NAFTA was passed. The opposition of unions, and it's complicated debate how much that was a part of deindustrialization in the areas in the U.S., but it played a role, as widely popularly considered part of it. And Hillary Clinton was associated with that. Hillary was also actually wrote the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, like a type of free market integration in Asia, designed to leave China out. And people call it NAFTA on steroids. Hillary Clinton later backed away from it, but she wrote it. So anyway, and I don't know if that was a major campaign issue, but it was certainly a part of it. During the time, a friend of mine who is at Standing Rock, she's a long-term socialist for decades, she went to the Standing Rock protest with her young son, and she drove back through the Midwest. Story I heard, she drove back through the Midwest through town after town, economically devastated, huge drug problems, meth, fentanyl problems, it was like many of these areas had a state of like total despair. She called it capitalist nihilism. It was utter despair. And just around the time Trump was on the TV, she saw Trump speak, and he said, "I represent change. I'm going to change things." And my friend said that, yeah, that's when she knew Trump would win. And I think he's right. People knew Hillary Clinton had nothing for her, had nothing for her. People said more wars. People knew damn well. And Hillary's deplorables comment, a basket full of deplorable people who supported Trump were a basket full of deplorables. It was type of liberal elitism. Hillary came off as like a scolding fifth grade school teacher whom everyone hates. And Trump was like the class clown who's leading a rebellion. So it's kind of understandable why some people would gravitate towards him. Trump was a con artist himself. He didn't offer anything, of course, but that's the situation. No one did. Okay, so then after Hillary Clinton lost the election, by the way, there was a book that came out. I'll try to find it. It was called, Hillary wrote a book shortly after, but I don't know, maybe 6 months after the election, said, What Happened? The title of her book was What Happened? And it was by Hillary Clinton, and then it said Hillary Clinton. And people were joking. It was like the only book that had both the question and the answer in the title. What happened? Hillary Clinton. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so shortly after Trump won, Hillary Clinton lost, there was some brief examination within the Democratic Party, like, why do we put up this neoliberal hack like Hillary Clinton? That was very quickly shut down by Russiagate. There was a steady stream for 3, maybe close to 4 years of Russia, blaming Russia. Russia. No, maybe we shouldn't have put up this neoliberal hack. No, it was Russia. Russia. It's a myth that all 17 security agencies signed on to Russiagate. It's actually cooked up by a group around James Clapper, and enormous pressure was put on the security agencies. Interestingly, the intelligence agencies, one of them include Coast Guard intelligence. Like, why would they have any involvement in this? But some of them later backed away from it a bit. But the media narrative was Russia. None of it was ever proven. None of it. The Mueller report was a dud. Came out with nothing. Mueller's testimony before Congress was even worse. He came off like a doddering fool. The media built him up as some ramrod, conservative but ramrod, straight shooter. He ran the FBI, and he ran these under Bush and ran these entrapment operations, which ruined people's lives. So he's a hard, like, morning. Anyway, so this Russiagate narrative, it fulfilled several and quite insidious roles. One thing, it shut down criticism of the Democratic Party, classic deflection. Like, why don't we? There couldn't be any exploration of the corruption. The WikiLeaks leaks, what WikiLeaks published, showed the actual corruption, massive corruption within the Democratic Party. That was shut down as blaming Russia. It reached hysteria, level of hysteria. At one point, I forget when it was, but the Washington Post had this article, said that one of the electrics, or the power company, one of the main power companies in Vermont. I used to live in Vermont, actually, the Central Vermont Power, CVP or whatever, said that they had laptops which used chips made in Russia, which had a potential backdoor to Russian security. The Russians could potentially sabotage it. They could shut off the power in the middle of the winter. A couple of days later, maybe I think as long as a week later, they retracted it. It was nonsense. It wasn't true. They had to say it wasn't true. But the damage was done. The idea was out. The Russians are hacking our power grid. And Rachel Maddow, who was really famous for this, she had she actually had she said, I have no evidence to back this up, but she had this hypothetical scenario that the Russians were going to take down the power grid, and I think it was northwestern state, like Montana or Wyoming, where it's known, maybe Montana, I think where it's known to be bitter cold in the wintertime. The Russians were going to shut down the power grid, shut down the power grid. There's no evidence whatsoever. But Rachel Maddow ran with this like hysteria level of, it was like really whipping up a war fever towards Russia, which is dangerous. They have Russia's nuclear weapons. Doesn't mean I support Putin or like the Russian government, but they had nothing to do. They had actually nothing to do with getting Trump elected. Really, the whole thing was extremely insidious, dangerous narrative. So it filled a couple roles: shut down criticism of the Democratic Party, built up liberal support for new Cold War with Russia, greater military spending, hostility towards Russia. Provided the excuse for greater internet, social media censorship. Everything was fake news, crackdown. Also, crackdown on the left, any alternate media, left or right. Also, any criticism of the Democratic Party from the left was Russian bots, so it was just shut down. Right, it was a quite insidious narrative. It wasn't as bad as the original McCarthyism, but it was close. It wasn't quite nearly that bad, but it was pretty insidious. Okay, so Trump. Trump is a horrible guy, but it's important to keep in mind the Democrats basically gave him his entire legislative agenda. First, they gave him his $730 billion military budget. They passed it. They renewed the Patriot Act, which was actually written by Joe Biden. Or I don't know if he personally wrote it. I mean, his office had someone write it, but he wrote most of it. Apparently, this section, Patriot Act, calls for greater surveillance, the Department of Homeland Security, and which ICE is a part of. Apparently, Biden, as far as I understand, didn't write that section that establishes DHS, but what he did write is bad enough, and he often brags about it. So the Democrats renewed the Patriot Act. They gave Trump his massive corporate tax cut. They gave him the CARES Act, which supposedly was a stimulus during the pandemic, but it was a massive, $4 trillion bailout to corporate America. They gave him everything he wants. For someone who's supposedly a fascist, they gave him an enormous amount of power. Nancy Pelosi famously ripped up Trump's State of the Union address, but right before redoing the Patriot Act. So it's kind of, they're Democrats who were never a credible opposition. The Russiagate narrative was promulgated as a way to fight Trump without actually fighting him, without doing anything meaningful, without mobilizing mass opposition, which the Democrats are always very much afraid of. Okay, there is a deep state. Liberals right now hate that term, and a lot of people on the left aren't too happy with it either. It's used by the right wing, and I'm not entirely sure how the right wing uses it. The term deep state came out of leftist analysis, more the analysis of Turkey in the 1970s. The idea was Turkey had a lot of turmoil, had several, military took power several times, ostensibly to block conflict between left and right, but really to crack down on the left. Later, the term of deep state meant that people really run things, and this term was later, a little while later, applied to Greece. And of course, every major, like bourgeois democracy, major industrial democracy, they have elected governments come and go, but the real people run things, or the real people run things. France famously went through periods of chaos, but the French civil service kept things running. But they're also below that, a deeper layer of people who really call the shots. In the U.S. situation, I think a better term than deep state might be national security state, probably a better term. But would be the military-industrial complex, which is gargantuan. It's gargantuan. Like military budget last military budget was 700 for fiscal year 2020 to 2021 is $730 billion about. For 2020 as a whole, apparently, according to Wikipedia, it's $940 billion, gargantuan, and most estimates say it's really close to $1 trillion a year. It's been steadily increasing since the end of the Cold War, at a greater level since 2015. I believe there's $60 billion since 2015. It's just insane, and it's politically very powerful. Half of all federal discretionary spending is on the military. The U.S. spends more on its military than the next, I believe it's 10 countries combined, which is insane. The U.S. has at least 800 bases that we know about, another 200 which are not fully known about, and probably even more than that. There's nothing on the planet even close to it. And it's been extremely destructive. In recent decades, the U.S. has destroyed Iraq. It went from having the highest standard of living in the Middle East, a large middle class, to now being what it is now, a war-torn hellhole. The U.S. did the same thing to Libya. Whatever you want to say about Gaddafi, Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. Now it's been, if the U.S. got involved in a war-torn hellhole where slaves are openly sold, the U.S. was orchestrated coups in Venezuela, 2 coups in Honduras, coup in Bolivia, and as I understand, coup in Paraguay as well. Nothing is close to it. Nothing is even close to the powers of U.S. imperialism. And I'll probably make a future video on U.S. imperialism. Plays several gargantuan military, plays several different complex roles, maintains the U.S. as a center of global capital accumulation, prop up the value of the dollar. The U.S. has what's called right of seigniorage, that is fiat currency, and U.S. kind of coasts on this to an extent, and somewhat complicated, but nothing on the planet is even close to U.S. imperialism. So the upshot of it is this deep state, this national security state, support Biden, solidly support Biden. They didn't like Trump right from the beginning. This was evident in 2016 primary. The Democratic National Convention had all these retired generals, presumably lifelong conservative Republicans, saying how much they support LGBT rights, for example, and how woke they were. It's even more so. This group, the solidly within the campaign, was behind Biden. They had 500 retired admirals and generals signed this thing supporting Biden. 100 former McCain staffers, and John McCain was a corrupt warmonger, supported Biden. The neocons, the neocon establishment from top down, Max Boot, those other people supported Biden. The Lincoln Republicans. These are quite insidious forces. This doesn't mean I like Trump. Trump's much of an alternative, but Trump was seen as wrecking the empire. He was incompetent. He was ruining the image, badly ruining the brand. And much of U.S. authority, much of U.S. hegemony depends on soft power, people having some respect for the U.S. or thinking it's a force for good. Trump was taking the mask off, taking the fig leaf off, and liberal, one of the main reasons they hated this. Plus, he was unstable. He was incompetent and unstable. They clearly were very much against him. So, as far as Trump's claims of rigged elections, I don't know. The Democratic primaries were definitely rigged. I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting that Sanders, I didn't support Sanders, but I understand why people did. He was, rallies, he got tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. I think it was one of the only few politicians in U.S. history, many decades, to get a following like that. He didn't do anything with it, dissipated, but he had following. Biden was lucky if he got a dozen people to go to his rallies. And he spent most of the campaign in his basement. Odd that Biden is the winner and Bernie was pushed out. There's exit polls in the primaries. Many of the primaries where Biden won, showed that exit polls showed Bernie way ahead, but the actual results were very lower for Bernie. Something was going on. I mean, it's kind of understood. In 2016, we definitely know it was rigged, and the thing with the app and the Iowa caucuses, everything was designed to keep marginalized Sanders. And then, of course, Obama got involved. The famous phone calls got the Klobuchar, Buttigieg to back out, to withdraw. Elizabeth Warren stayed in long enough just to hurt Sanders, and she came off as a craven opportunist. And then Obama made a famous phone call to Sanders, convinced him to drop out. And it was Biden, who was an unpopular guy with no following. He had won one primary, and people expected him to drop out. Actually, he emerged as the front runner, and now he's the president. There are claims, Trump's claims that the Democrats rigged it. I don't know. There's one, the Convo Couch, which is a leftist YouTube channel I watch. They regard themselves as election integrity activists. They claim, they say, we don't like Trump, we hate Trump, but it could be the Democrats really did rig the elections. I don't know. I haven't followed it that closely. The Republicans famously used voter suppression to black people in the South. He very blatantly uses suppression, while the Democrats rigged their own internal elections. It's kind of well known. So I don't really know. So the ruling class clearly wanted Trump out. There was the Transition Integrity or Election Integrity Project. Whitney Webb and Diane Johnston, a few other people talked about this. It was a role-playing exercise at Harvard. Well, it was real. It's not a conspiracy theory. It actually happened. It's well documented. There were people from the Clinton campaign. John Podesta was there, as well as some other people, lots of other people. And they played. There was initially to guarantee like a fair transition, like Trump was going to pull any shenanigans. But part of the scenario was where Trump won by a wide margin. And the scenario called for a military coup, literally against Trump. I don't know how likely that would have been, but the ruling class wanted Trump out, and I don't think there's much chance he would have won. He would have been allowed to win. There was a lot of fear that Trump was going to pull a coup. Trump was going to cancel the elections or ignore the results. I think that was absurd. There was ever any possibility that would happen. First, Trump never had military or institutional support. Any classic fascist dictators, Hitler and Mussolini, they had institutional support. Hitler had supported the German army and major industrialists. Mussolini, after the March on Rome, was it 1921, I believe, he had supported some of the aristocracy of Italy. They had support. Trump didn't have it. Trump had the right-wing militias. They weren't gonna. They were no match against overweight guys with beer bellies and assault rifles weren't going to take over the country. Same thing with some people claim that the ICE and Border Patrol are personal loyalty to Trump. That may be true, but there would be no match either. The attempt in Wisconsin to kidnap the right-wing group, the attempt to murky militia to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. I kind of suspect, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect it was set up by the FBI. And during the Bush administration, the FBI did this kind of stuff all the time. They ran these entrapment operations, at least several times. They supposedly foiled a Muslim tourist plot. It was basically they formed this thing on recruit people online, some alienated kids, immigrant kids, stupid alienated kids. They got them all riled up and got them into this conspiracy, and then they nabbed them. They did the same thing with supposedly leftist conspiracy. And this is well documented. Guy, FBI informant from New Orleans who became active in anarchist circles, Brendan Darby. He actually recruited and coached a group of these kids, young kids who were rightly pissed off the system, but they didn't know what to do about it. He coached them to make Molotov cocktails, and he brought them in a van. He actually coached them and pushed them to do this. And then the Molotov cocktails they're going to use at the Republican National Convention was 2004. Then the FBI, the kids were completely set up, and so then the FBI nabbed them. The feds nabbed them, and they did so. And this ruined people's lives. People had years in jail for this. This was under Mueller, who was supposedly a liberal hero during the Russiagate narrative. Narrative back then was that Muslims are going to destroy our country. Muslim terrorism is a major threat. And we got to depend on the security state to crack down. Muslims in alliance with leftists are destroying. They hate us because we hate us because of our freedom. Nonsense like that. Now the narrative was that if Trump is reelected, we're going to have a fascist takeover. I don't think that was ever popular. Ever possible. I don't know this for sure, but I strongly suspect the plot was cooked up by the FBI. I don't know this for sure. I'm not discounting these militias. They are scary. They are dangerous. I'm not discounting them. Michigan particularly is known for a militia movement. It's the dynamics from the auto industry. Detroit is mostly a black city, and they've had a long history of radical movements. And then there's the hinterland, largely white, hard hit by deindustrialization. So some of the dynamics gave rise to militia movements, right-wing militia movements. Also, much as the militia movements predate Trump. They date back to the early 90s. They're about neoliberalism, deindustrialization, and also the Gulf War. The first Gulf War was the Operation Desert Storm. People came back from that kind of shattered, and they were alienated, pissed off, and no radicalized petty bourgeois layer. Trump did not control them or command them, and they weren't even really part of the same movement. They used each other. But the narrative looked like Trump was running this fascist coup, and which was misreading. I think it was badly misreading the situation. And it gave us this almost hysteria levels of fear. Like, you got to vote for Biden. Biden was a corrupt corporate hack and had no appeal. And it was a rigged election. But this would give justification to vote for Biden. Now, I don't think Biden's an alternative. I really don't think. I think actually he's probably the worst evil. Not that I support Trump. I have no support for Trump, but not that Biden is the worst evil. These really horrible forces which have gathered around him. I think we're certain to have a war someplace. Military-industrial complex, the national security state, the neocons, the warmongers are there. And look at his cabinet appointments already are really kind of disturbing. They're just as bad as Trump. The rhetoric has got to be nicer. The really LGBT, like I think the head of the CIA is a black Jew, I guess, from the Caribbean. One thing I've heard. Another Buttigieg is openly gay, transportation secretary. They're woke LGBT nominees, but they're pretty horrible. Popular term called intersectional imperialism. Yeah, that's exactly right. Using identity politics in the service of imperialism. Horrific. So that's what we're up against. I think the radical left, the anti-capitalist left, has to clearly, in the coming period, it's kind of scary. Many people have said, if Biden gets in, whoever comes next will be worse than Trump. 4 more years of neoliberalism and austerity, which is starting to happen. Only have a woke face. So you're going to be a reaction even worse than Trump. People, maybe Tom Cotton, maybe somebody else. Much, much worse. More years Neil. So the radical left, I think, a task is to clearly differentiate themselves from the Democrats and from Biden. And we're not those people. We're not, those woke. I support LGBT rights, obviously, and of course, but it's used in the service of imperialism. The left has to clearly differentiate itself. That's the most important task. And it's hard to do if you've already been campaigning for Biden, even by so many people on the left, radical left or socialist, decades of activism. The socialist movement have been trying to get people to vote for Biden. Terror of Trump, overreaction against Trump. And it's extremely damaging narrative, hard to differentiate yourself if you're in the Democratic Party already. So I think that's the thing going on. Okay. Which takes us to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a Democratic Party congressperson from the 14th District in New York, which is Brooklyn, part of the Bronx, and I think Queens, I'm not sure. It's a low-income, largely Hispanic area. She's Puerto Rican background. She was a member of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. In an earlier video, I talked about them. The DSA has had explosive growth around the time of the first Sanders campaign. They probably claim to be around 70,000 people. Active members are probably much less. Earlier video, I kind of talked about them a little bit, and I interviewed Doug Green, talking about Michael Harrington, the founder. The DSA is basically a faction of the Democratic Party. They have caucuses and internal factions and groups and debates and stuff, but none of them really are breaking from the Democratic Party. They maybe locally do some worthwhile activism in some areas, but ultimately they function as part of the Democratic Party. And I think we need to solidly break from that. Anyway, AOC is, she's popularly called, was a member of the DSA. It's unclear her current association. To be in the DSA, all you have to do is pay $60 or $5 a month, and you're a member. It's unclear. I doubt she's disassociated herself from it recently. She backed away. I don't think she goes to meetings or whatever. And they have no control, no discipline whatsoever over her. They enthusiastically support her, but they have no control over her. Okay. She ran against the Democratic primary against Joe Crowley, who was a machine Democratic politician. He was a 10-term congressman. He kept going because no one votes in the primaries, nobody cares, and people, low-income people, rightfully or disengaged, rightfully see the mainstream politics has nothing for them, so who cares? And Joe Crowley was a white guy, nothing. I don't think he did much for his for his district. So she had like an upset victory, and she won in the general election. And she got a lot of publicity as a Democratic socialist. I, to blunt, I think she's a fraud. She's gotten a lot of excitement, a lot of publicity, but I think she's a fraud. First of all, she voted for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House first time. She called Pelosi Mama Bear, and which is originally she said she wasn't going to do that. Some of her earlier takes said, no, I'm not going to vote. I will never vote for Pelosi. They didn't. Pelosi is far right wing, blocks Medicare for all, blocks anything progressive, famous for that. So she voted for Pelosi, called Pelosi Mama Bear. Famously, she had shortly after she got in, she had this protest in front of Pelosi's office with the Sunrise Movement. It recently came out that Pelosi knew about it. It was a stunt. Pelosi knew about it. AOC is building her own brand. She actually apparently supported the coup attempts in Venezuela. Someone asked her how she felt about it. Well, she said, I defer to party leadership. Party leadership supports the coup. First, the coup in Bolivia, she apparently tried to have it both ways. She retweeted a tweet by Sanders, which came out strong. Bernie Sanders just came out strongly against the coup, but at the same time, she had herself photographed with a coup golpistas, a coup, holding a coup flag. She knew what she was doing. She definitely knew what she was doing. She kind of tried to have it both ways. If she was really opposing these coups, she should have said it very loudly. This is horrible. This is a human rights abuse. This is horrible U.S. imperialism. But she was kind of waffling. She didn't really push things too much. She most likely voted for the CARES Act. Jimmy Dore says this. CARES Act was basically a $4 trillion corporate bailout. One of the biggest, according to what I read, the biggest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. It's horrific. And she probably voted for it. She won't really say it was an unrecorded voice vote. Jimmy Dore thinks that she voted for it. I believe him. Okay, so she's intent on, like any progressive Democrats, building her own brand without really opposing substantially. She talks a good game. She talks about good things I agree with, but she doesn't really push it, or she doesn't organize everything. As an aside, people called Bernie Sanders the organizer in chief. He didn't organize shit. He never stepped out of the political electoral politics. Bernie Sanders could have called for a general strike, and he should have. He had enough political authority to do it. Few people did. He would have pulled a general strike until they have national health care, but nah, he was deferential to the Democratic Party. Okay, AOC is a fraud, and I really think that what we're going to have to do is, one of the tests of the left is call out these people, not give in to the flavor of the week. And after AOC, people should leave the Democratic Party. They're always after Bernie is AOC. There's one person after another, flavor of the week to bring people back in. We need to solidly break. And that's where Jimmy Dore comes in. Jimmy Dore is a political comedian. He's been around for a while. He's was with the Young Turks TYT network. This is where, as I understand, he got his start. Young Turks Network was a liberal, still is. It's around a liberal network, I guess. Like their TV channels, TV shows, YouTube channels. Cenk Uygur, associated with Cenk Uygur, Anna Kasparian, a few other people. They came out of the more liberal media, which arose around the second to maybe first Bush administration. Like liberals were talking about the right wing, and Rush Limbaugh, and all these shock jocks. And like shock jocks, well, we need to counterattack. So there was Air America and a variety of John Oliver, and for a variety of liberal or liberal left people came out of it to oppose. Okay, fair enough. Many of these people were still around, moved more to the right or mainstream, especially during the Trump administration. They're not really, or during the Obama administration, they're not adversarial at all. Jimmy Dore is one of the people who moved further to the left. Last year, he broke from TYT, mainly over the Russiagate thing. They were pushing it. He didn't believe it, and he was politics for much further to the left. And to his credit, okay, Jimmy Dore supported Sanders, but critically supported him. And as this 2020 election went on, he was increasingly critical, like very critical. Sanders was weak. One thing, he Russiagated himself. There was one point accusation. Supposedly there were some accusation. Supposedly FBI or somebody said there were Russian influence in the Sanders campaign. They were trying to bolster Sanders against Biden. It was clearly nonsense, but Sanders, instead of aggressively counterattacking, he agreed with it. I want to tell Mr. Putin to leave my campaign alone. Like, what? I mean, he was Russiagating himself effectively. That was a horrific, horrible, huge damage to his own campaign. There were many times he could have really aggressively attacked Biden, and he didn't. He didn't. My good friend Joe Biden. He said some good. Sanders always says some good things. Dore kind of support him, but very increasingly critical, and became increasingly disgusted by him. Such a weak campaigner. As I said, Sanders didn't organize anything. There were times he could have organized them, and he didn't. He kept his campaign within the context of what was acceptable to the Democratic Party. And then famous how he lost. Now, after he dropped out, he endorsed Biden without making any demands, without demanding anything. And you give away all your chips. And Dore was like enraged by this, no qualifications. I endorse Joe Biden without making any demands on him and without anything. And it was horrible. Later on, I think Sanders kind of complained. Well, Sanders actually said really stupid stuff like Biden presidency will be the most progressive administration since FDR, which is complete nonsense. If you know Biden's history, 40-year history of very pro-right-wing, bolstering racist security state, Biden famously was responsible, designed the architecture of mass incarceration. Ramped up. It started under Reagan, was ramped up under the Clinton administration. Biden once said that, as well, a lot of the mass incarceration is due to local police. And yeah, that's true. But his 1994 crime bill, allocated $2 billion for ramping up local police. Drug laws, Biden was tightening up the drug laws, famously super anti-drug, the Patriot Act. And Biden designed the system which Trump walked through, which Trump used. That's why I think, Biden was probably forces behind Biden are far more insidious. Not that I have any support for Trump. Okay, anyway, Jimmy Dore brought up this stuff, and I think he was absolutely right. And he had some allusions in Tulsi Gabbard. He even said this himself. Tulsi Gabbard was from Hawaii. She was kind of an anti-interventionist. She actually called out Russiagate, supported Assange, criticized U.S. role in Syria, which all these things you're not supposed to do. And she made something of a ripple. She probably appealed to his anti-interventionist sentiment in the U.S. military, seemingly. Okay, well, anyway, Dore probably had some illusions in her, possibly was emotionally attracted to her, who knows. But when Tulsi Gabbard endorsed Biden, Jimmy Dore took it really bad. This radicalized him. This pushed him far out of the Democratic Party. And even in the past 6 months, Jimmy Dore was kind of liberal left, angry liberal left. He moved to the far right. I'd regard him as a comrade. I don't think he's read Marx or Lenin or Trotsky, whatever. Maybe he has by now. But he's an intelligent. Now, I regard him. He's on the far left now. I don't know where he's going to, but so far he's saying some really good stuff. Now, some people don't like him. I do. I like him. But some people he curses a lot, and he's angry. He gets angry. Sometimes it's really funny. His face turns red. It's funny to watch. Anger is real, and it's justified. it's fully justified. He gets angry. He attacks the Democratic Party from the left, which they desperately need. No one else is doing this. No one is giving it free pass. Okay. And he goes on these epic rants. So, a couple things. He curses. Personality turns some people off. Okay. Some people can call him an Assad apologist. Now, I remember maybe 28. I don't remember 2018, maybe but 2014. I don't remember when. But the ISO, Socialist Organization, which broke up, collapsed about 2 years ago of a rape scandal. Anyway, the New York branch of the ISO, which was the most conservative branch, they refused to endorse Howie Hawkins, who was an independent Green Party candidate or independent leftist candidate for governor of New York. They refused to endorse him or support him on the grounds that he accepted an endorsement from Jimmy Dore. I think this was 2018, which because Jimmy Dore was an Assad apologist. Like, this is crazy. It wasn't the real reason. There was that transparent reason. Now, okay, as far as being an Assad apologist, and one person criticized Dore, said, he attacks anyone who attacks Putin. Okay, first background, I talked about U.S. imperialism, and it's devastated in the last couple of decades, the last couple of years, devastated whole societies. There's nothing like it. Most countries in the world have crappy anti-worker governments. Yeah, Iran, Russia. Yeah, they do. I totally agree. But, okay, the U.S. role in Syria, let's examine it. And the Syrian civil war is extremely complicated, and could take another 5 or 6 videos to cover it. And what happened is basically mass protest movement emerged in 2011. I support it, and I'm not an Assad fan. I supported Max Blumenthal, who's usually called an Assad apologist. He said it's a brutal Assad ran a brutal police state. Max Blumenthal says this. What happened is from 2011 to maybe 2015, there was something called Operation Timber Sycamore, where the U.S. spent $5 billion in close cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, funding these basically jihadist groups. And U.S. has been doing stuff like this for years. And earlier, from about 2011, the U.S. spent at least $5 billion fostering these. And even way back when 1946, I believe, the French got out, the U.S. orchestrated two coups in Syria pretty early on. And one of the motivations for Syria joining Egypt, Egypt was a United Arab Republic back then, was fear of U.S. meddling. So U.S. has had a long involvement in Syria, and bears some of the responsibility for regimes like Assad or North Korea, reaction to devastating U.S. meddling. So the U.S. fostered these jihadi groups in Syria, and there was no moderate opposition, except at the very beginning. There was no moderate opposition, no secular opposition. It's just snuffed out very early on. U.S. didn't create ISIS, but certainly created the conditions for ISIS existing, for ISIS arising. There were some suspicion that U.S. kind of connived at aiding ISIS at times. There's one story. There's in Dallas, Texas. There was a guy who ran a plumbing supply company. Forget his name, but he had this fleet of trucks which he sold. And he sold the fleet of trucks under the condition that the markings be taken off, like his name, and like Joe's Plumbing, and the name of his company and phone number and stuff be taken off. So, okay, sold it under the condition that his markings be painted over or removed. Okay, so like 4 months later, local TV stations started showing his trucks being driven by ISIS in Syria. Like, how did this happen? And being Texas, he got death threats from people. He explained, I had nothing to do with this. ISIS did pick up, overran U.S. bases, or somehow, or they picked up a huge amount of U.S. military equipment, fleets of Toyota trucks and things like that. Huge quantities of military equipment. Nobody quite knows how this happened. So it's a little odd. Anyway, so people were really, ISIS morphed into a major controlled a big chunk of Iraq and Syria. It was largely defeated by the Russians. U.S. played a role, bombing Raqqa, both Russia pushed back U.S. imperialism. Now, I'm not a fan of Putin, but any country I would support them as far as they push back U.S. imperialism is the main enemy. U.S. imperialism is overwhelmingly the main enemy. Other country, Putin's Russia is a crappy anti-worker government, so are a lot of other places. But understand the proportion of forces, and I'm going to do a future video on U.S. imperialism. I'm a Trotskyist. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Trotsky had a famous interview, I think in 1938, with, I think it was a British magazine, I don't remember, but it's titled Learn to Think. He basically said proposed a hypothetical situation where a Brazil ruled by a fascist government would have a war with so-called democratic Britain. And back then the British Empire was still huge and the center of capital accumulation. It was moving towards the United States, but the British Empire was still really powerful. And he said in a situation like that, a war between a fascist Brazil and a democrat Britain, you support Brazil. And I think he would say some of the same stuff today. I mean, it's horrible on all sides, but U.S. imperialism is still enormously powerful. Anything that pushes that back, you can't, substitute class struggle for geopolitics, and that's what tankies do, or some people do. I don't believe that, but I believe geopolitics is part of it. Like the protests in Syria when the Islamists were pushed back, the protests revived. They couldn't protest when the Islamists were there. The protests revived. And many of the protesters temporarily made their peace with Assad, like, we don't like you, but the Islamists are actually a lot worse. Max Blumenthal had an video of a tour of a Christian neighborhood outside Damascus. And if the Islamists one that would snuffed out, he showed a secular space where different religions and cultures could combine. That would have been something valuable, worth keeping. As bad as Assad might be, that's something really worth keeping. Now, why Dorr was criticized, there were two. He exposed or disagreed with the media narrative. First, the white helmets, so as a humanitarian aid group that won all kinds of international prizes, and they were apparently a hoax cooked up by British intelligence. Stuff came out. And more recently, there were two whistleblowers of the OPCW, Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Warfare. They had some really credible doubts on the narrative of Assad gassing his own people. Obama kept saying, red line, U.S. would only get involved if poison gas is used. He kept saying that. That's the red line. That practically guarantees, invites a poison gas attack. And sure enough, it happened. Some of the scenarios don't quite make sense. There's so many holes in the argument. Very complicated. But anyway, he had people on who were pushing back against this narrative, which is why the ISO was a third campus group, and there are people like that, and they hate this. Now, whatever you think about Assad or Syria, it's, the monumental crimes, ocean of blood of U.S. imperialism is just staggering levels. And to pick up, he's an apologist for Assad. He gets Assad wrong. That's kind of a ridiculous thing to use against him. Even if you disagree with him, it's kind of relatively minor. And he's not defending Putin. He's not defending Putin. He barely mentions Putin. He doesn't even talk about Syria that much. But he's had people on who disagree with the narrative. He's had people, Aaron Mate especially, who dissect the Russiagate narrative and tear it to pieces, and very credited Russiagate's complete horseshit. And he exposes all the Democratic journalists who are covering for the Democratic Party, mostly hacks, corrupt hacks, and he's 100% correct. So, he's gotten a lot of enemies. He's gotten a lot. And doesn't come off as super sophisticated. He's raw. He's intelligent, very intelligent guy. He's not stupid by any means. He's filled with facts. He's not a shock jock. He's filled with facts and very well researched, which he knows people are going to hold things against him. So he has to. He's self-deprecating humor. He doesn't claim to be. He says, I'm a pothead comedian. He probably smokes weed in the morning. Nothing wrong with that. It's legal in California, and a huge number of people I know do it. I occasionally use it myself, but anyway, so nothing wrong with that because I'm a jag-off comedian. I smoke pot in the morning, and even I know how corrupt these people are. He goes on these rants. Okay, so now, he criticized Howie Hawkins. That's another thing. I have friends of mine who I really like and respect who are big Howie Hawkins fans. I was not a big fan of him. I met him a few times. He was in Portland, Maine 2 years ago, and I met him, talked with him one summer. I have doubts about Howie Hawkins. First of all, Howie Hawkins Russiagated Jill Stein. I mean, he brought up the Democratic Party canard that Jill Stein was in Moscow and met with Putin. Just briefly sat, which was the International Health Conference. Jill Stein's a doctor, and she was a candidate for president. She was in Moscow, briefly sat at a table with Putin. That's all that happened. And the Democrats jumped on that. Hey, she's a Russian bot. She's working for the Russians. She's a Russian bot. She's working for the Russians, which is nonsense, clearly nonsense. And they use that to bash anything to their left. Back in 2016, they're doing it more even now. Okay, so Howie Hawkins jumped on that. Said, yeah, instead of defending it, no, nonsense. Said, yeah, Jill Stein never should have done that. It's a little suspicious what she was doing. Oh, what the hell? And Jill Stein herself has backed away. I mean, I think she kind of endorsed Howie Hawkins, but has kept a lot of distance. Same with Juma Baraka, kept a lot of distance from Howie Hawkins. Kind of support him, but not too energetically. And Howie Hawkins supported Julian Assange kind of up until 2016. And then, well, it kind of implied that he was part of helped get Trump elected, which is nonsense. I think Howie Hawkins was trying to cover his flank, like from being Russiagated. Anything to the left of the Dems is massively Russiagated. He was trying to cover his bases, but it just came out disastrous. It basically appealed to liberals, opportunistically appealed to liberals who weren't going to support him anyway. And also Green Party itself, I mean, there's a petty bourgeois formation. I was close to the IG, the internationalist group, for a time. I no longer am, but they would hate Howie Hawkins or anything Green Party. I kind of see their point. But I voted, where I live is ranked choice voting. So I voted for Gloria La Riva. I wrote in Gloria La Riva. And first I thought I couldn't do a write-in, but I asked him, said, yeah, I could. Vote Gloria La Riva, number one. I checked Howie Hawkins, number two. I don't know, whatever. It's bullshit anyway. It's like, who fucking cares? It's total bullshit. Okay, but anyway, these are some debates around Jimmy Dore. And he gets in these fights with people. Okay, I like Jimmy Dore a great deal. Okay, so he's recently making waves. I talked about AOC. He recently, or maybe 2 weeks ago, brought up this proposal idea that why don't we hold Nancy Pelosi to account? This Pelosi is famously against Medicare for all. Myself, Medicare for all might be kind of inadequate. We desperately need a national healthcare system. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We desperately need, whether Medicare for all is the way to go. Okay, I think we need more of a Canadian style or British style system, but okay. Anyway, Pelosi and the leaders of the Democratic Party famously oppose this. So Jimmy Dore brought up the fact that why don't you threaten to not vote for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker this time? Like, the progressives have a greater leverage in the House of Representatives. The Democrats still control it by a smaller margin this time, and they've much greater leverage. They could threaten to threaten to block Pelosi being renominated. Well, there's so AOC. Now, interestingly, Jimmy Dore was originally a big supporter of AOC. In fact, right after she was elected, Jimmy Dore was the first show she was on. Interview was Jimmy Dore promoted her, but then kind of became disillusioned, like all Democrats. There was increasing disillusionment there. People call it the Dore Referendum. Jimmy Dore suggested that AOC and the progressives threatened to block Pelosi being reconfirmed as Speaker of the House. So this triggered an uproar, huge uproar on social media, on Twitter, YouTube, leftist YouTube channels. Basically what happened is AOC did not respond directly to Dore. In fact, she hasn't really answered his calls or contact since way back. Originally, Dore. They were close. Dore featured her, and originally, but that recent in the past quite a while hasn't had anything to do with Dore. But there's an NFL football player, Justin Jackson, who's with the Oakland Raiders. He's a Medicare for all activist. He was on Dore. Dore interviewed him. Very moving. He described how his mother died and it could look like was a preventable uh, illness. Basically, because his family couldn't afford medical treatment. It's very moving and very sad. So it's the crimes of U.S. healthcare system. So he's a healthcare for all, Medicare for all activist. So he jumped on, and AOC responded to him, and they had this debate going on. So, and this triggered this much wider debate, and whether Dorr is being too nasty or too nasty to AOC or whatever, and many people backdoor. Basic idea that AOC said, no, I don't want to do this. It would be too risky. We can work on other issues like raising the minimum wage to 15, which Pelosi says she supports. We have other issues we can work on. It's too risky. I don't want to risk my political capital for doing this. The door then other people slammed into it. It's hypocrisy. I mean, time to get off, take a shit, or get off the pot. Why we don't care about fostering your political career when you actually do fight for something. There's no chance. It doesn't seem likely the Democrats would lose being a Speaker of the House. I mean, it would go to another Democrat. It might be a period of chaos if Pelosi is they vote against Pelosi, but it would go to another Democrat. Democrats still have. So it's been huge, kicked off this huge fight. It exposed the hypocrisy about the Democratic Party of Pelosi herself. If say AOC hypothetically voted for this, and Pelosi would have had to say no, voted to block Pelosi unless she, it's not going to accomplish anything per se. I mean, it's not going to accomplish legislation, but what it would accomplish is showing up the hypocrisy of the Democrats. They're denying us health care in the middle of a pandemic. That's what's happening. And would just show them up. But AOC doesn't want to do this. Obviously, she's building her own brand, her own career too. She's not going to go against Pelosi. And, Dorr knows this. Dorr definitely, people know this. So there's been this big, real fight erupted. Some YouTube channels who I like kind of supported Dorr, and then some more start off like Dorr, sort of liberal left, moved to the far left. The Convo Couch with Isabella Fiorella and Pasta Jardul is really good. Nico House, a few others. Richard Medhurst, who's a Syrian who he gets very angry too. Younger guy than Dorr, kind of allied. And a variety of others supported Dorr. Strongly supported Dorr, calling out the phoniness of AOC and the phoniness of the Democratic Party as a whole. Big part of what the radical left has to do is bring people out of the party. Okay, so there's a counterattack from a variety of people. Anna Kasparian, who was one of the leaders of the Young Turks, who Dorr used to be a part of. They definitely turned against Dorr. Anna Kasparian had a series of tweets. This is all much as is fought out on Twitter, and for a while it still is. The Dorr referendum is trending on Twitter. It's making a political firestorm, which is what we need. He's doing what socialist organizations should be doing. Okay, so Anna Kasparian said, well, maybe I could see Dorr's point, but he's acting in bad faith. He's building his own brand. He's just doing totally. He mentioned he had illusions in Tulsi Gabbard. So there was a counterattack against that. Dorr and others had a counterattack. Dorr brought up investigation by the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal, and that Anna Kasparian is, to be blunt, a NATO shill. That is supposedly a leftist. She went to essentially NATO conference, Munich Security Conference. I think it was last year. I don't remember when it was, but she went there. It was sponsored by arms manufacturers, banks, NATO, the NATO apparatus, and the German government. It was essentially a NATO convention. And she interviewed Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, who's a blood-drenched warmonger. Madeleine Albright's very famous for saying, when I think Barbara Walters interviewed her years ago, I mentioned the fact that 500,000 Iraqi children, because of sanctions, which basically Bill Clinton enacted, 500,000 Iraqi children died. Do you think it was worth it? And Madeleine Albright famously said, yeah, it was worth it. I mean, Madeleine Albright was instrumental in these sanctions. basically genocidal sanctions. She helped instrumental in dismembering Yugoslavia. I mean, she's a blood-drenched warmonger. Anyway, Anna Kasparian interviewed her, and it was obsequious. Oh, I'm so honored to be with you. Oh, God. And she was most likely paid pretty well. So called her as a Max Blumenthal, and Jimmy Dore called her as a NATO shill, which she is 100%. So who's acting in bad faith? And she's supposedly the left. And then a variety of other leftish figures vouch on his own YouTube channel. He's a complete idiot. He was calling out. Apparently he didn't even understand the procedural rules in the House, things like that. So we'll see how this goes. We'll see how this goes. And so Dorr is making waves. He's doing what really should be doing. It's pretty certain that AOC will continue to refuse to do this. She'll vote for Pelosi for House. I mean, she'll make up any excuse in the world, but they're exposing the hypocrisy of progressive Democrats. No, you don't support the Democrats, especially the progressive Democrats. Every couple of years, they'll make up a shiny new thing to bring people back in, and it's a disaster. So this is it. I hope you've enjoyed my video. Hope you enjoy this. I don't mean to offend people. Some of this may be controversial, and I have friends and people I personally like and respect who maybe might have strong feelings. Otherwise, just listen to this and keep an open mind. And thank you. Goodbye.